April 17, 1945. At 15,000 feet over the blood-stained waters of Okinawa, the sky was a hazy, chaotic gray, choked with the smoke of burning ships and exploding anti-aircraft shells. Down on the surface, the United States Navy was fighting a terrifying new type of war. The radar screens inside the combat information centers of the American destroyers were completely whited out by incoming bogies.
Surface contact bearing 070, closing fast.
All ahead flank, ready torpedoes.
The Japanese Imperial Navy, pushed to the absolute brink of total defeat, had abandoned conventional tactics. They were hurling waves of kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, massive coordinated suicide armadas designed to turn American carriers into burning steel coffins. Sitting in the cockpit of a dark blue Grumman F6F Hellcat, Lieutenant Eugene A. Valencia listened to the frantic, static-laced pleas of the radar picket ships below. Valencia, a 24-year-old from San Francisco, was a fundamentally different breed of fighter pilot. By the spring of 1945, the era of the swashbuckling lone wolf ace was dead. The skies over the Pacific were no longer suited for individual artists looking for personal glory. The sheer volume of Japanese aircraft, swarms of fighters escorting bomb-laden kamikazes, required a completely different approach. Valencia was a ruthless, calculating tactician. He viewed aerial combat not as a gentleman's duel, but as a cold, industrial process. To execute this process, the United States Navy had provided him with the ultimate industrial tool. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was arguably the most significant piece of aeronautical engineering of the Pacific War, because it was the only fighter explicitly designed backward from the enemy's strengths. In 1942, the Americans had recovered a nearly intact Mitsubishi A6M0 in the Aleutian Islands. They reverse-engineered its aerodynamics, discovering that while the Zero possessed a terrifyingly tight turn radius at low speeds, its unarmored airframe became dangerously stiff at high speeds. Grumman didn't try to outturn the Zero. Instead, they built a 12,000-pound flying brick, bolted a monstrous 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine to the front, and armed it with 6 50-caliber machine guns. The Hellcat was designed to dive faster, roll quicker at high speeds, and absorb an ungodly amount of punishment. But a superior machine is useless without a superior system. Valencia recognized that standard Navy formations were too rigid, often fracturing into chaotic one-on-one dogfights where nimble Japanese fighters still held a dangerous advantage. So, he gathered his division of 4 aircraft, himself, Lieutenant James Harris, Lieutenant Junior Grade Rowland Mitchell, and Ensign Clinton Smith, and relentlessly drilled them in a custom tactic he called the Mowing Machine. The Mowing Machine was a lethal evolution of the famous Thatch weave. Instead of breaking apart when attacked, Valencia's 4 Hellcats acted as a single, terrifying organism. They flew in a wide, fluid diamond. If a Japanese fighter dove on one Hellcat, the American pilot would act as bait, dragging the enemy across the flight path of the other 3. It was a continuous, rotating meat grinder of interlocking fire. It required absolute telepathic trust. No one broke formation to chase a fleeing enemy. No one broke the geometry for a personal kill. Before we lock our canopies and follow Valencia's division into this meat grinder, if you believe the true tactical genius of the Pacific War deserves to be highlighted over Hollywood fiction, please hit that like button. It signals the algorithm that real, mechanical history is what this community wants. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss a briefing. Also, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We read every single comment to keep these legacies alive. Now, let's jump back into the desperate skies over Okinawa. On the morning of April 17th, Valencia's division, operating off the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, was vectored by the fighter director toward a massive radar blip closing in from the north. As they climbed through the overcast, the true scale of the Japanese assault materialized. Cruising at 17,000 feet was a massive formation of enemy aircraft. Valencia's sharp eyes quickly identified them. There were at least 30 to 40 Japanese fighters, a mix of nimble Nakajima K-43 Oscars and advanced Nakajima K-84 Frank fighters, heavily armed and flown by surviving veteran instructors. They were flying top cover for the kamikazes below, looking to drag any American interceptors into a sprawling dogfight. The arithmetic was staggering. Valencia had 4 aircraft, the Japanese had nearly 40. Standard naval doctrine dictated that a 4-plane division should make a single, high-speed slashing pass and immediately use the Hellcat's weight to dive away and run for the fleet. Engaging a 40-plane swarm in a sustained fight was mathematically suicidal. But Valencia keyed his microphone, his voice dead calm over the radio static. He didn't order his men to hit and run. He ordered them to tighten up the diamond. They weren't going to run. They were going to feed the entire Japanese formation into the Mowing Machine. Valencia pushed his throttle forward, the massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine roaring as he pointed the blunt nose of his Hellcat directly into the center of the 30-plane swarm. The most perfectly executed, one-sided slaughter in the history of naval aviation was about to begin. When you strap 4 12,000-pound fighter aircraft together into a single, unbreakable geometric formation, you are no longer flying individual airplanes. You have constructed a flying fortress out of thin air and rotating propellers. As Lieutenant Eugene A. Valencia led his division of Grumman F6F Hellcats directly into the center of the 30-plane Japanese formation over Okinawa, he was relying on a fundamental psychological vulnerability in the enemy. The Japanese pilots, flying highly maneuverable Nakajima K-43 Oscars and K-84 Franks, were conditioned to expect American formations to shatter upon impact. Standard combat instinct dictates that when a pilot is fired upon, he brakes hard to survive, dragging his attacker into a one-on-one turning fight. Valencia's Mowing Machine was built on the absolute, terrifying discipline to ignore that instinct. At 17,000 feet, the 4 heavy Hellcats sliced into the Japanese swarm at over 350 miles per hour. Valencia and his wingman, Clinton Smith, formed the lead section. James Harris and Roland Mitchell flew stepped up and slightly wide, forming the trailing section of the fluid diamond. The Japanese veterans reacted instantly. Seeing the heavy, blunt-nosed American fighters barrel into their airspace, a flight of 4 Ki-84 Franks rolled inverted and dropped from their top cover position. The Ki-84 was Japan's finest late-war fighter, fast, heavily armed with 20mm cannons, and flown by instructors who had survived years of attrition. They confidently swooped down, perfectly sliding onto the tails of Valencia and Smith. In any other squadron, this is the moment the American pilots would have slammed their control sticks over, desperately pulling maximum G turns to shake the attackers. Valencia's division didn't even flinch. Instead of turning away, Valencia and Smith maintained their heading, acting as deliberate high-speed bait. They trusted the sheer, rugged thickness of Grumman's armor plating to absorb any glancing blows. Behind them, Harris and Mitchell watched the Japanese fighters commit to the pursuit. The moment the enemy pilots fixated on the lead Hellcats, they suffered from fatal target fixation. They were completely blind to the geometry closing like a steel trap around them. Harris and Mitchell simultaneously snapped their heavy fighters into a sharp, coordinated inward turn. Because they had maintained their airspeed and altitude advantage, they didn't have to outturn the Japanese Franks. They simply scissored their flight paths directly across the rear of Valencia and Smith. The Japanese pilots suddenly found themselves staring into the leading edges of 2 Hellcats, each armed with 6 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Harris and Mitchell didn't need to maneuver. They just had to pull the trigger. 12 heavy machine guns roared in unison, dumping over 100 armor-piercing incendiary rounds per second into the narrow corridor of airspace. The crossfire was absolute. The leading Ki-84 didn't just take hits, it was structurally pulverized. The concentrated stream of kinetic energy sawed through the engine block, shattered the cockpit, and severed the right wing entirely. The Japanese fighter violently tumbled end over end, erupting into a massive fireball. Seconds later, a second Ki-84 caught Mitchell's burst directly in its fuel tanks and disintegrated into a cloud of burning aluminum rain. 2 kills. The engagement was less than 20 seconds old. The surviving Japanese pilots violently pulled out of their attack runs, shocked by the sudden vaporization of their wingmen. They had expected a chaotic dogfight. Instead, they had just flown face first into an industrial wood chipper. But the Mowing Machine didn't stop to admire the wreckage. The true brilliance of Valencia's tactic was its continuous fluid rotation. The moment Harris and Mitchell completed their firing pass, they crossed over each other and became the new bait, while Valencia and Smith hauled their Hellcats around to become the shooters. The Japanese swarm, realizing they heavily outnumbered the Americans, tried to overwhelm the system with sheer mass. Dozens of Oscars and Zeros buzzed around the 4 Hellcats like angry hornets, attacking from above, below, and the sides. But the diamond formation was airtight. Every time a Japanese fighter committed to an attack angle, it was instantly pinched by the intersecting guns of the supporting element. Inside the cockpits, the physical and mental toll on the 4 American pilots was staggering. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines were screaming at high manifold pressure. The cockpits reeked of cordite and sweat. The pilots' heads were on constant swivels, calling out incoming bogeys over the radio with cold, clinical precision. "Bogey dropping on your 6, Smith. Hold your line." Smith held his heavy control stick dead steady, ignoring the terrifying stream of 7.7mm tracer fire snapping past his canopy. He trusted the system. Valencia whipped his Hellcat across Smith's tail. He pulled the required lead on the pursuing Oscar, letting the Japanese fighter fly directly into his reflector gun sight. Valencia squeezed the trigger. The burst was devastatingly short, barely a second long, but at 250 yards, the 650 calibers tore the lightweight Nakajima fighter to shreds. The Oscar flipped onto its back, trailing thick black smoke, and spiraled toward the Pacific Ocean. 3 kills, then 4, then 5. The sky over Okinawa became a graveyard of burning Japanese aircraft. The mechanics of the Mowing Machine were functioning with terrifying perfection. But the greatest threat to Valencia's division was not the enemy, it was human nature. As the kill count climbed, the adrenaline in the American cockpit surged. When a Japanese fighter absorbed a burst of fire and limped away, trailing smoke but not immediately exploding, the overwhelming biological instinct of a fighter pilot is to break formation, chase the crippled bird, and finish the job. It is the primal urge of the hunter. Valencia had drilled this urge out of his men. The golden rule of the flying circus was absolute. Do not break the machine. If an enemy plane smoked and ran, you let it run. You never abandoned your wingman for a personal kill. You reset the diamond, protected your brother, and waited for the next victim to fly into the trap. This mechanical discipline is what made the April 17th engagement a masterpiece of naval aviation. For over 20 minutes, against a vastly superior numerical force, the 4 Hellcats absorbed everything the Japanese could throw at them. They didn't just survive, they systematically butchered the enemy. But as the battle raged on, the ammunition bins inside the heavy folding wings of the Hellcats were running dangerously low. The thick steel armor of the Grumman fighters had absorbed dozens of glancing hits, but the aircraft were getting battered. The sheer volume of the Japanese swarm meant the Americans could not stay in the Mowing Machine indefinitely. They were running out of bullets, and the Japanese were finally realizing that the only way to break the American formation was to ram it. In the grinding, chaotic vortex of a massive aerial furball, time dilates. For Lieutenant Eugene A. Valencia and the 3 pilots of his flying circus, the April 17th engagement over Okinawa had devolved into a grueling test of mechanical endurance and absolute psychological restraint. For 20 minutes, the 4 heavy Grumman F6F Hellcats had flown locked in their fluid, rotating mowing machine Diamond. They had systematically absorbed the attacks of a 30-plane Japanese swarm, using the enemy's own target fixation against them. Every time a Nakajima K-84 Frank or a K-43 Oscar dove on a Hellcat, another Hellcat scissored across the flight path, trapping the Japanese fighter in a lethal intersection of .50 caliber crossfire. The sky was littered with falling, burning debris, but the geometric perfection of Valencia's trap was about to hit a terrifying, unavoidable wall: the physical limits of their ammunition. Each Hellcat carried 400 rounds per gun for its inboard machine guns and 240 rounds for the outboards. In a sustained, trigger-heavy engagement, that equates to roughly 30 seconds of total firing time. By the 25th minute of the battle, the deafening roar of the Browning M2s began to sputter. Inside the cockpits, the terrifying metallic clack, clack, clack of empty breeches cycling on dry chambers echoed over the roar of the Pratt & Whitney engines.
The division was going bingo. They were completely out of bullets, and the surviving Japanese pilots realized it. Frustrated, humiliated, and operating under the fanatical desperation that defined the final months of the Pacific War, the remaining Japanese fighters changed their tactics. If they couldn't outturn the American geometric trap, and the Americans were no longer firing back, they would simply use their aircraft as kinetic weapons. They would ram the Diamond to break it apart. A lone Japanese pilot in a K-43 Oscar peeled off from the swarm, shoved his throttle forward, and dove directly at the tail of Valencia's wingman, Ensign Clinton Smith. He wasn't pulling a deflection angle to shoot. He was flying a dead-straight collision course. Standard survival instinct screamed at Smith to break formation, to violently yank his heavy control stick and dive out of the way to avoid being physically cut in half by the spinning propeller of the Japanese fighter. But Valencia's training was absolute. Do not break the machine. Smith held his line. His Hellcat was a massive 12,000-pound target, and he offered his tail to the incoming kamikaze, trusting the system with his life. From the opposite side of the Diamond, Lieutenant James Harris hauled his Hellcat into the firing vector. Harris knew he had perhaps a 1-second burst of ammunition left in his failing belts. He didn't have time to walk his tracers into the target. He calculated the geometry, waited until the diving Oscar was a mere 150 yards from slamming into Smith's tail, and squeezed the trigger for the final time. A desperate, sputtering burst of remaining .50 caliber rounds tore out of Harris's wings. It was just enough. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds shattered the Oscar's canopy and struck the pilot. The Japanese fighter violently twitched, missing Smith's rudder by mere feet, and tumbled uncontrollably into the ocean below. The trap had worked one last time, but the guns were now entirely silent. "Break and dive!" Valencia barked over the radio. The 4 American pilots simultaneously shoved their control sticks violently forward and pushed their throttles past the detent into war emergency power. The massive barrel-chested Hellcats flipped inverted and plunged toward the Pacific. This was the final advantage of the Grumman Ironworks design. The Hellcat was heavy, and gravity loved weight. As the airspeed indicators buried themselves past 400 miles per hour, the lighter Japanese fighters desperately tried to follow the Americans down. But their unarmored, lightweight airframes simply could not handle the crushing terminal velocity. their ailerons locked up under the extreme aerodynamic pressure. The Japanese pilots were forced to pull out of the dive, watching helplessly as the 4 blue American fighters vanished into the clouds, racing back toward the safety of Task Force 58. When Valencia, Harris, Mitchell, and Smith finally caught the arresting wires on the wooden flight deck of the USS Lexington, their aircraft were utterly exhausted. The massive radial engines were ticking with extreme heat, the oil pressure was dropping, and the thick steel armor plating was pockmarked with glancing machine gun hits. But not a single pilot had a scratch on him. When the intelligence officers debriefed the division and verified the gun camera footage, the final tally defied belief. In that single, meticulously executed flight on April 17, 1945, Valencia's division had shot down a staggering 14 enemy aircraft in one combat action. But their legacy didn't stop there. Over the course of their combat tour, the flying circus refined the mowing machine into a weapon of mass destruction. By relying on absolute geometric discipline instead of individual ego, Valencia, Harris, Mitchell, and Smith shot down a combined total of 50 Japanese aircraft. They achieved this unprecedented slaughter without losing a single Hellcat and without a single man in the division ever being wounded. Eugene Valencia finished the war as the Navy's third highest scoring ace with 23 personal kills. He proved that in modern warfare, the most lethal weapon in the sky wasn't a reckless maverick, it was an unbreakable, disciplined system. When we look back at the dogfights of the Second World War, it is easy to get swept up in the romantic myth of the lone aviator. But the true air war was won by industrial logistics, cold mathematics, and the absolute discipline to stick to the blueprint. That is the unfiltered reality we strive to bring you here at WWII Frontliner. If Valencia's tactical genius gave you a newfound respect for the Hellcat pilots of the Pacific, do us a favor and crush that like button. It fuels the channel and helps us bypass the algorithm to bring real history to the forefront. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you are locked in for our next mission breakdown. And before you head out, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We monitor every comment because those real-world connections are exactly why we keep these archives open. Valencia built a machine, and the machine never broke. Keep your formation tight, and we'll see you in the next one.